You're all set?
I'm all set.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Glad to see you. Today, I thought I'd talk about something. Now, probably you know more about it than I do, because I didn't grow up here. I moved here in the 70s. But I was fascinated to find out that there was a connection here between the Ryan family and the Roosevelts, and that Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt were frequent visitors here, and they stayed over at a house here while he was governor and one time when he was president. I think that's phenomenal that you had a candidate for president who actually became president, and he stayed here and spoke to the people of this county. I think that's remarkable. So I did a little research, and in that research, I found this, The Boy at the Four Corners. This was written by one of Ryan's boys. So it's remembrance of Albion, the stores that were in Albion, the people that his parents reacted with, people who came to do work on their house. It really is phenomenal to hear it from someone who was a child and remembers growing up here in Albion. And about the last quarter of the book is about his experience and his family's experience with Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. So we got it from firsthand view of a little boy and this Mr. Roosevelt in his house. And I think it's fascinating to read this because it really is from that viewpoint of living here, growing up here, and meeting these people. And also, in this book, The Town of Gaines Sesquicentennial, the foreword was written by Mrs. Ryan. And she tells about her coming here to live. And I'll read you just a little bit. It says, history of the town of Gaines. Driving at 35 or more miles an hour in a modern automobile on the hard-surfaced highways of the town of Gaines, viewing the pleasant homes amid the fertile grain fields and the extensive orchards interspersed with small rural villages, it's hard to imagine the land thickly forested with only faint Indian trails where our ridge road is located. On a hot 4th of July in 1921, I set foot in the town of Gaines and had thought my new home was to be Albion, New York. But I was told in no uncertain terms, you live in the town of Gaines. Now, the Ryan house is across from the bowling alley. The big brick house across from the bowling alley, that's where she came to live. And she was told she was in the town of Gaines, not the town of Albion. It was sometime before I began to realize that the town of Gaines was a township to realize the miles encompassed there. Gaines Village, Childs, Fairhaven, East Gaines, West Gaines, Gaines Basin, Five Corners, Eagle Harbor. It was some time before I fully realized that all of these constituted the town of Gaines. However, in a short time, I realized the beauty of the homes and roads and byways of Gaines and the fine character of its citizens. I felt proud to be an adopted daughter. And that's Harriet Fitz Ryan, Bernard Ryan's wife, that they asked to do the foreword to this in 1959. So this book and the Ryan's son's book. Now, Four Corners to him was in Albion, over the canal, where the stores started. Because when I first read the title, I thought, well, it's Five Corners. He's closer to Five Corners than he is to Albion. But his view of Albion at that time was the Four Corners. That was where all the stores were. So we'll go to who we're really talking about here. The big brick house was built by Daniel Ryan in 1890. He passed away shortly after that, and his son, Bernard Ryan, took over the house after his mother passed. Bernard Ryan was a judge in this county, a very well-known, respected man. He was, let's see, I told you about the house. He went to school in Albion, graduated from Albion High School in the class of 1907, and read law for 2 years before being admitted to the Albany Law School, from which he graduated in 1912. Now that's Bernard Ryan Jr. He was in World War I, commissioned as second lieutenant. He helped to establish the Sherritt Post number 35, American Legion, and was the first commander of that post. He was also a member of the 78th Division Veterans Association of Western New York. In 1921, he married Harriet Earl Phipps, who was a newspaper writer and novelist. The Ryans had 4 sons who grew up in Albion. The eldest, William Fitz Ryan, became a representative in Congress for the Upper West Side of Manhattan and served from 1961 until his death in 1972. During the 1920s, Bernard Ryan ran twice on the Democratic ticket for district attorney, but was defeated both times by the incumbent William Munson. Active in the Democratic Party politics, he was elected chairman of the Orleans County Democrat Committee. He served as a delegate to the National Democrat Convention in 1928 and was a delegate at large for the 1932 convention. So the man was very politically driven, very involved. Although Mr. Ryan had been admitted to the bar and maintained a law office on East Bank Street in Albion, he toured widely as an actor in Jesse Bontel's stock company and appeared with the Winthrop Ames Stock Company in Boston. He was later both a stage manager and actor on Broadway. In 1920, Bernard Ryan first met Eleanor Roosevelt when she was on a campaign tour in Western New York for women's suffrage. From this period of time, the Ryans and Roosevelts became close friends. In 1929, Franklin Roosevelt, then governor of New York, visited the Ryans at their home in Albion while touring the state by canal boat. In August 1930, the Roosevelts were again house guests of the Ryans when a historic marker was dedicated in the town of Gaines. During the years Franklin Roosevelt was president, the Ryans were frequent visitors at the White House. Harriet Ryan always sent the president a birthday cake. So they were quite close through their whole lives. There was, in the American Legion, Ryan wrote home to talk about his service. He sent a letter and 2 letters in 1919 that tells about his experiences. I won't read those to you, but let's see. Yeah, I've read that too. The Ryans spent their summers in Albion and their winters in New York City. Mr. Ryan toured widely as an actor and in Boston, and later was a stage manager and an actor in Broadway. Mr. Ryan was the first commander of Sherritt Post number 35. He was the organizing president of the Lemuel Cook Chapter Empire State Society Sons of the American Revolution. Local, he was also an early advocate of the redevelopment of Oak Orchard Harbor at Point Breeze and used his influence towards that end. Mr. and Mrs. Ryan had 4 sons. William Fitz Ryan, U.S. Congressman for the 20th District of New York from 1961 until his death in 71. Bernard Ryan Jr., Hewitt Fitz Ryan, M.D. of California, and Leonard Ames Ryan. Judge Bernard Ryan died of cancer in 1975. So just before I moved here. So the Ryan family was influential. They had a lot of push here, but they also knew the Roosevelts and were close friends of the Roosevelts. In this, there are letters that Eleanor Roosevelt posted. This is December 4th, 1936. She says in her post, "We had a nice little talk before lunch. Mrs. Ernest Lindley and Mrs. Bernard Ryan of Albion, New York, joined us for lunch." In 1944, I returned home in time to see Mrs. Bernard Ryan from Albion, New York, who was in Washington for a day or two, and to greet my guests who spent the night with me. So Mrs. Ryan spent the night with Eleanor Roosevelt. February 3rd, 1938 at the White House, 7:15 to 8:20, Mrs. Bernard Ryan and 6 other guests. So there's actually records of the Ryans being at the White House when the Roosevelts were in charge. This is, Mrs. Roosevelt had a column called My Day. This is August 21st, 1951. It happens to be a novel by a young woman whom I've known for a long time. I knew her first when her sons were babies. I saw them grow to little boys, and now they are nearly grown up. Probably most of them think they are completely grown. She came from the South, and when you read the book, you'll see that it breathes the spirit of Southern heritage. It's called Mother of the Groom. So Mother of the Groom is a book written by Harriet Fitz Ryan. And Mrs. Roosevelt is publicizing it, saying you should read it. The sesquicentennial of Gaines, I told you, she wrote the promo for that. And I have found that I can give you a little bit of a feel of the Roosevelts and the Ryans from this red book, where he tells his story as a little boy, knowing Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt. When I think of Roosevelt, it is a summer morning and I'm in the yard in front of our house. Tony Ackery is there in his worn white overalls, with his hammer banging from the loop below his right hip, and his flexible rule in his special pocket. He's measuring and sawing big planks. He assembles them into a broad ramp that rises from the edge of the driveway to the level of the porch, some 6 or 7 steps above the ground and higher than my head. Dad has hired Tony to build the ramp because the governor is coming. The governor arrives a day or two after Tony finishes the ramp. With a great wail of sirens far down Main Street, motorcycles roar and throb into the south driveway and follow its horseshoe around behind the house, past Gertrude, who stands on the back porch holding the baby and calling, "Hello, Governor Roosevelt," as the open touring car circles past the full line of diapers hanging on the back porch. Afterward, a friend of my mother says, "Weren't you mortified to have the Roosevelts come in the wrong way and go round past those diapers?" To which Mama replied, "The Roosevelts have 5 children of their own. I reckon they've seen diapers before." That was a good reply. When the Roosevelts were there, Mrs. Ryan invited the entire town to a buffet luncheon for the governor. And Mama tells Gertrude to serve the hot biscuits now. The governor is jolly. And they sat down to eat, and just as he was about to dig into his plate of ham and potato salad and biscuits, Governor Roosevelt stops and looks around and says, "Why, where's William?" "I guess he went up to his room," said Mama. "You know, Governor Roosevelt, he really is an awfully shy boy." The governor puts down his knife and fork. "You just go tell him I won't eat one bite till he's down here with me." And he does it. Mama gets Bill, who's 7, and I'm 5. And everybody makes room for Bill's plate on the card table in front of the governor. And the meal proceeds. The governor says things that makes everybody laugh. He enjoys his lunch, especially the biscuits. After lunch, the governor shuffles through the side door and out onto the porch. The photographers from the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle and the Times-Union want to take pictures. So this was a big deal. you had 2 Rochester papers coming to take photographs because Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt were here. We gather round as Elliot lets go of his father's arm and the governor stands alone with his canes. The crowd is out in front yard, but we are around here on the side because the side porch faces the south and lights better for the photographers. We are just where I'm standing later when I watch Sambo bark at a different bark to summon Prince to chase the stray dog, just where I watched the speeder kill Jiggs and hear him say he was hurrying to the dentist, and just above the steps where Walter Monticelli tells me how to ride a bike. Bill and me in our white linen suits, short pants, and matching tops. And Mama smiling up at the governor, and Dad very tall and proud, and Mrs. Roosevelt smiling down at Bill and me in a photo that hangs in my father's study in the same house for 49 years. So they were very proud of their connection with the Roosevelts. Then they tell about the Roosevelts getting in the car, and we ride to the training school. That's the women's prison, was called the training school. It is a women's penitentiary, officially called the New York State Training School for Women at Albion, and the governor is including it in an inspection tour across the western part of the state. Then they move from there after they've toured there. Now we are at the canal. The inspector's waiting for us. It's an official yacht of the governor, a big boat, I suppose 60 or 70 feet long. The governor has come to Albion aboard it, though probably he didn't cross the entire state on it, since 6 miles an hour is the canal speed limit. We all get aboard, we push off, and people wave goodbye and bid us bon voyage, and we head west into the late afternoon sun. Governor Roosevelt is settled in a big wicker chair in the main cabin. Mama and Dad and Mrs. Roosevelt and Aunt Holland and Uncle Tom sit down in wicker chairs too. They're all talking at once and having a grand time. I can tell the governor, just like my folks, loves to sit and swap yarns. Bill and I scramble all over the boat. We discover the engine room, the decks. The bridge we're approaching is the Gaines Basin Bridge. A bunch of people are up on the bridge waiting for us to go under, and I recognize Gertrude. She's been relieved of duty at our house, has gone home. She lives up Bank Street, and not terribly far from Gaines Basin Road. She has cut a huge bouquet from Mother's garden, and she's lowering it to the boat on a long string. A man runs out of the pilot house and grabs it. Gertrude calls down, "Hello, Governor Roosevelt," the way she did from the back porch this morning, just as we glide under the bridge. So people followed where Roosevelt was going and made sure they said hi and they were pleasant and they had to see him. When we get to Medina, the next town west on the canal, we pull up to the bank and all of our family get off. Someone's brought our car, the 1928 Olds. We say our goodbyes and thank the governor and Mrs. Roosevelt for the ride. Dad takes the wheel and we drive back to Albion. It happens all over again at the end of the next summer. My brother Leonard is now 7 weeks old, so another brother's been born. This time I'm dimly aware that he's campaigning for re-election, Mr. Roosevelt. And this time Mrs. Roosevelt goes upstairs to see the baby. She seems very tall as she stands beside the crib looking down at him. The governor has not come by boat this time, and we all pile into the open tour car. Oh, wait a minute, I jumped it here. Yeah. Okay. The governor's not come by boat this time, and when we all pile into the open touring car, the police escort turns north and heads down 98 for Gaines, 3 miles away. At Gaines, we pull up to a big wooden platform like an outdoor stage. It's hung with red, white, and blue bunting. The platform is already crowded with people, sitting in 4 or 5 rows of chairs. So they hear Roosevelt speak right in the town of Gaines on the ridge. Then there's a parade headed by the American Legion Color Guard from the Sheriff Post in Albion, a post that was organized by my father, and only the 2nd or 3rd in New York State. The post band is right behind the color guard, followed by all kinds of fancy floats and exhibits mounted on farm trucks and tractors. So there's a big parade going on in Gaines. When the flag and canvas are pulled off, a giant boulder is revealed. What this is they are having a ceremony to unveil the big stone marker that's on Ridge Road. And the giant, on its face is a bronze plaque, and the words read aloud, "Genesee to Niagara Historic Ridge. I sing of the great ridge of the highway our children shall see, which lies like a belt on Ontario's shore, carved out in the wisdom of ages before, for the races which yet are to be." DeWitt Clinton, 1810. And the great work of internal improvement he preserved through good report and through evil report, with a steadiness of purpose that no obstacle could divert. Erected by Ridge Road Improvement Association, Orleans Chapter DAR, Orleans County Pioneer and Historical Association, State of New York. This marker is a typical specimen of Medina sandstone from the noted quarries of Orleans County, operated more than a century. Supply and practically inexhaustible. From these visits of the Roosevelts, I have the memory of the governor as a dominating man, smiling, joking, boosting me into his lap while he sits in the big wing chair in front of the fireplace, friendly, asking about the town and countryside he drives through and drinking it all in. I have the memory of Mrs. Roosevelt as tall and quiet, except when she hurries out on deck to wave to the receding bridge and call, "Thank you, thank you." And when she goes upstairs to see the baby, then she's all warm and smiling. The governor becomes a face on a poster. Bill and I ride out from town with Dad on Saturday and Sunday afternoons all fall, nailing "Re-elect Governor Roosevelt" placards to trees and telephone poles. So they helped promote him here, also in Orleans County. Just before dinner one night, Mama calls Bill and me to her and says, "Now when Daddy gets home tonight, you must say, 'Hello, Judge Ryan. Governor Roosevelt has appointed my father to a judgeship on the 5-man New York State Court of Claims. The year is 1930. And it's the beginning of a 31-year career for the Court of Claims bench for my dad. Mom and Dad celebrate Thanksgiving 1931 as guests of the Roosevelt at Warm Springs. So Roosevelt's hosted the Ryans, also invited them. My mama's father is William C. Fitz, a lawyer who at age 28 in 1894 was elected Attorney General of Alabama and who served as Assistant Attorney General of the United States during the Wilson administration. In March 1932, he goes from Binghamton to New York to visit Roosevelt's headquarters, then announces that Alabama's 24 delegates to the convention will be for this governor. There is no doubt about that, he says, and on May 14th, he visits Roosevelt at Warm Springs and assures him of 24 Alabama votes. So it's Bernard Ryan's wife, her father, has guaranteed Roosevelt 24 votes from Alabama. So there was play back and forth there. You warm my hand, I'll warm yours. Mom and Dad go out to Chicago at the end of June. Dad is the delegate at large from New York State, and Mama covering the women's side of the convention for the Rochester and Buffalo newspapers. Both had gone to Houston in 1928 for the same purposes. So they were both traveling to help support Roosevelt and his thoughts. Inside, on his bedroom wall, Bill tacks up the Roosevelt for president and Lehman for governor posters that we are nailing to every telephone pole. They stay on that wall for 45 years. On Friday evening before Election Day 1932, Mrs. Roosevelt arrives after dark, held up in Medina by a jealous Democrat town chairman who purposely delays her in hopes of throwing her off schedule. Bill and I have been building a fancy soapbox racer, really more than a soapbox racer, with a wooden cart for a chassis and a body to rival those by Fisher of Detroit. More than merely something you put your legs inside and stick head and shoulders out of, it's all enclosed in roof. We covered its wood frame with cardboard cartons, flattened out and tacked on, and added tin can headlights and a Model T wooden steering wheel from Jake Rosen's junkyard. The car is ready in the garage behind the house when we hear the Roosevelt sirens wailing and see the row of motorcycle headlights coming down Main Street. We rush into the garage and Bill gets inside and I push while I usually provide the power. And as Mrs. Roosevelt's car pulls into the driveway, we race into the glare of the headlights yelling, "Hello, Mrs. Roosevelt." She stands there and oohs and ahs and walks all around our cars and says, "Isn't it wonderful?" and lets us know she has never seen anything quite so sensational. I think it shows she's still relating to those little boys. Okay, this is later on. On this Friday evening, Mrs. Roosevelt again speaks at a reception at the DAR house, with everyone and anyone in town invited if they're interested. Then she comes back to our house to stay, sleeping under the patchwork quilt handed down from Aunt Louie, who was grown before the war between the states. Next morning, Mama and Dad drive her, no dead battery this time. Apparently they went out one time and the battery was dead in the car. Halfway to Syracuse, where a state car meets her. On the way, she says, "You know, Harriet, Franklin may very well win this election." "Of course he's going to win," says Mama. "You really think so?" "I know it." "Well, if he does, we'll have to move to the White House." "You certainly will. And that's where I'll be, and I won't see my friends." "Of course you will," said Mama. "Harriet, I want you to promise me something. Promise me you will never come to Washington without phoning me to say you're there, no matter what you think is going on. Will you promise me that?" "All right, I promise." So she still wanted to maintain contact here with the Ryans, even though her husband will probably be president. There's a period where there's a book printed. The title page says, "This book is by Eleanor Roosevelt, Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt." Imagine some editor sitting there telling her they'll have to put her husband's name in so people know who she is. On the flyleaf in her handwriting in the inscription, "To Bernard Ryan, Jr., from a friend who happens to be the author, Eleanor Roosevelt." I like her sense of humor. On election night, I go to bed in my room and toward the rear of the house. Our big old house is a front stairway and 2 landing turns. A long hall down the center, upstairs and back stair going down again to the pantry and kitchen. Soon after the governor's victory is announced over the radio, the Sherritt Post American Legion Band arrives at our doorstep, playing "Happy Days Are Here Again," full blast, and it marches in the front door, up the front stairs, down the hall, past my bedroom, down the back stairs, through the kitchen, pantry, dining room, 2 living rooms, front hall, and out the door. I never woke up. Well, we were all invited to the inauguration. Bill and I received our own invitations, addressed to us in flowing calligraphy. But I'm 9 and Bill is 10, going on 11, and we're supposed to stay at the Mayflower Hotel. So they go down. In the reviewing stand directly in front of the White House at the inaugural parade, we sit in the row just behind the president. We go into the White House and the inaugural reception is underway. Mr. Roosevelt stands in the receiving line and says hello and calls us by name. We shake hands with about 1,000 people, have tea and tiny cookies in the East Room. After a while, we shake hands all over again and go back to the Mayflower. We're still frozen. We're getting ready to go to the inaugural ball. Dad is putting on his white tie and tails. Mama has a long glittery dress. Bill sighs and says, "I'm getting sick and tired of being introduced." That sounds like a kid, doesn't it? Every November, Mom bakes tons of Christmas fruitcakes from Grandma Cochrane's secret recipe. She sends them to all the folks down south and to old friends everywhere. She's been sending them to the governor's mansion in Albany for 4 years, and now she sends one to the White House. Mama, we say the Secret Service men are sure going to enjoy that fruitcake. But early in January comes a note from Mrs. Roosevelt telling Mom how they cut her fruitcake at a big family dinner and how much they enjoyed it. And the fruitcake goes out, and a note from Mrs. Roosevelt comes back every Christmas as long as the Roosevelts live. We're invited to a second inauguration in 1937. Now, whenever Mama goes to visit her folks, she calls Mrs. Roosevelt. And if Mrs. Roosevelt's in town, which is not always, Mama's invited to a luncheon or to a tea, and a couple of days later, in her newspaper column, My Day, Mrs. Roosevelt mentions that she was there. And that's what I read to you before, Mrs. Roosevelt's column. The convention in Chicago, again in 1940, Jim Farley hires Bill, who is now 18, and is about to enter Princeton in the fall as a page working out of his office at the convention. Bill is, at least figuratively, at Farley's elbow during the split over the third term issue. He gets more than a taste of politics and wants still more. 3 or 4 years later, while I'm a student at Princeton, some kind of ad hoc wartime political organization on campus invites Mrs. Roosevelt to come to speak. And darned if she doesn't accept. Tickets for Alexander Hall are distributed free, and a big dinner books the entire dining room of the Nassau Tavern, with Mrs. Roosevelt expected to arrive soon after lunch and spend the afternoon touring the campus and visiting with the president and Mrs. Dodds. So while this is going on, Mrs. Ryan comes. And he says, Mama steps up to President Dodds and says, she's Mrs. Ryan, and her son called at his office this morning, and she's known to Mrs. Roosevelt a number of years and had no idea that she'd be in Princeton today, but she's so glad she is, and she wouldn't dream of being in town with her not saying hello. President Dodds looks uncomfortable. Actually, he looks uncomfortable with her, not Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Ryan are in town, and says she'll be here in a moment. The elevator door opens. Mrs. Roosevelt moves into the lobby, taller than most people there. President Dodds says, Mrs. Roosevelt, this is Mrs. And before he can get the last word out, Mama and Mrs. Roosevelt are in each other's arms. Mrs. Roosevelt saying, why, Harriet, what are you doing here? Then she turns to me, whom she hasn't seen since Springfield in 1938, and says, hello, Bernard. In her speech to standing room only in Alexander Hall, Mrs. Roosevelt refers to the days when her husband was governor of New York, and they crossed the state to visit the picturesque villages along the Erie Canal and inspect the state institutions in faraway places. The reference is so beautifully integrated into her address that no one would dream it was all ad-libbed and just out of memory. So that was all taken from this Red Book. And there is one in circulation in the biographies under Ryan, if you're interested. I think it shows the close relationship of a family here in Orleans County and who was to become the President of the United States. And to think that they would have dinners at the brick house and invite the whole community. And in part of the book, it tells about them fixing the food and about taking the food and having people come up and fill their plates and going out and sitting in the front lawn on chairs. And it was so full that they couldn't fit another chair in. So, talk about opening your house to the community. I think the Ryans did that. It was a unique piece of history that I thought was great here. Phenomenal that Roosevelt was here when he was governor and when he was president. That says quite a bit about the connection between those two families. Anybody have any questions?
I just want to say that I have read that whole book, and if you've grown up in Albion, you want to read that book. It's really good.
Yeah, because he starts out telling about the different businesses, and who's on Main Street, who's on the bank, and from a boy's point of view. And what the store was like.
Landors and Harry Shabetta's. All those things.
Yeah, all the stores that were here. Because Landors was here when my husband and I first moved here, and then closed up shortly after that. But that had been a staple here for years and years and years. But he does tell in the first part of the book.
Yeah, it's a great book.
About the businesses in Albion and where he went as a child. And like I said, about the last quarter of the book is about his family and the Roosevelts. So it's in biography under Ryan, R-Y-A-N, if anybody's interested in reading it.
Where did the Roosevelts live? Obviously before presidency. Do you know what area?
Wasn't it Hyde Park?
I was going to say, I think it's Hyde Park in New York City, isn't it? I believe.
Yeah, you can view, you can tour parts of the estate there.
Yeah.
My sister went out to college in Marist. We went out to Hyde Park a couple of times while we went out to visit her. And it's neat.
Yeah, and it was kind of nice in that the Ryans, Harriet was a journalist, and she would go to New York City for certain events, and she would stay with the Roosevelts. I mean, talk about having an inn, you know? Anybody else? Yeah.
When he told about them going to the movie, and they were playing Dixie,
Yeah.
he said, stand up, they're playing Dixie. He said, we all stood up, even Papa.
Yeah. Yep. It's a song for the South, and she wanted everybody to respect it. Anybody else? Yeah.
A friend of mine told the story that his grandmother was the cook at the Hewitt household. And the first night that Eleanor stayed overnight, they found out that she liked grapefruits with the breakfast.
Oh.
Everybody was out looking for grapefruits for Eleanor.
Yep, you wanted
And
to.
I didn't think they did find one that was a little bit mushy, but it was okay.
Yeah. Well, at least it was sweet if it was mushy. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
You're welcome. You're welcome.